Good morning. Thank you very much. As my mother language is Spanish and we have no translation, I'm going to read the keynote address in English, and I apologize about the possible mistakes. The commemoration of the 25th anniversary of the fall of the Berlin Walls is not only an undeniable and moving tribute to freedom, but also a call to reflection, since the luminous date filled humanity with hope, making some international leaders and social interpreters believe that fighting and violence had ended once and forever, which was not so. In spite of that, the fall of the wall has a meaning by itself, because it represents the dissolution of the Soviet bloc dictatorial regime, the reunification of Germany, and the regaining of buried democratic and liberal values. Germany had experienced the worst period in its history because of the Nazi nightmare, and was able to rebuild its health after 1945 with courage and dignity. But the rise of the wall in the 61 not only meant a gaunt for Germans, but for humanity as a whole. The affront of a whole that split a city and a country, separating families, stories, and feelings. In that sense, the commemoration of such a day encompasses a tribute to the unsung heroes that pulled down the wall, thousands of Berliners who pushed from both sides with their hearts and their lives to overcome infamy. As well, it is a tribute to the artists who painted the wall, and a warm memory to Rostropovich in Mortancello, who pervaded the years of division and violence with the magic of his music. The way Berliners celebrated the fall of the wall of shame portrays in a favorable and extensive way Berlin's spirit, touched from ancient times by liberal sentiments. The old land of Goethe and Beethoven had its compensation after the two World Wars, when Germany overcame the Nazi nightmare, and Berlin has its own, becoming after the fall of the wall as one of the most progressive and thriving cities in the world. In spite of having been the capital of racism and xenophobia, Berlin currently keeps an open identity. Despite the Nazi interregnum, the city has a long and rich history regarding immigrants. In 1685, Frederick II the Great welcomed 20,000 French Huguenots persecuted during the religious war. In the 18th century, thousands of Jews arrived from Russia and Eastern Europe, and after 1920, the fugitives of the Bolsheviks revolution found in Berlin the shelter and safety they were looking for. Thus, after the war in 1945, Germans scattered throughout Europe began to return. In recent decades, waves of immigration, including Russians, Romanians, Greeks, Turks, also Vietnamese, found in Berlin a friendly and hospitable city. Turkish immigration in Germany constitutes a unique process in the social development of the German nation after the Second World War. According to the German Federal Statistical Office, Muslims account for 3.7% of German total population. Out of this, about more than 2 million citizens are of Turkish origin, and nearly 300,000 live in Berlin. Therefore, the reconstruction of Berlin and its current spiritual and cultural luminaries are one of the great milestones in history. The road toward vindication. While it is a fact that humanity gives orange to or accepts the worst threats to human rights and peace, the reconstruction process are more frequent and perhaps less famous. The United States of America and Germany, two nations that play a key role in sustaining modern civilization, have undergone in the 19th and in the 20th century deep reconstruction processes that lay the foundations of vindication. Throughout history, we find other remarkable cases of vindication, such as the epic struggle waged by Mandela in South Africa, perhaps the most outstanding and generous example of civilization conversion. As well, the Catholic Church, past and present, account for a worthy struggle to overcome centuries of persecution and dogmas laid down by the Church itself. Between 1861 and 65, as you know, the United States endured the American Civil War of secession, which could have made fall the country's unionist project and the democratic ideas and values that sustained it. Racism and slavery were in such full force in the American society of mid-19th century that the confrontation between a manufacturing and slaveholding economy and an industrial model formed the basis of the armed conflict. The end of the war meant the finalization of slavery, a process that took several years, but did not bring racism to a conclusion, which kept discrimination in place until the second half of the 20th century. However, that still there are isolated expressions of racial violence, we can certainly affirm that the American is one of the most progressive societies in the world in terms of equal rights and opportunities for all races. Modern society has become multiracial and multicultural, which proves that nations are capable of reacting in a positive way against their worst behaviors. The same can be said about Germany, where it is possible to trace the roots of anti-Semitism long before the rise of Nazism, a fanatic movement that used leadership to implement the idea of extermination, leading this country to commit the worst affront to human dignity. The interpretation of this phenomena debunks the Marxist vision of history based on class conflict, the criticism of capitalism, and economic factors, given that were the religious, cultural, and ethnic process what prevail, a lesson we must learn at present. The contemporary historians begin to pay more attention to the hidden roots of violence process, which mix religions, nationalism, collective ignorance, bigotry, and occultism. With regard to Germany, some liberal visions had already put an emphasis on this issue. Albert Camus and Raymond Aron, going against the grain in a solitary venture, identified the religious aspect of National Socialism. 19th century Germany was deeply racist as it was in the Middle Age and in the beginning of modern times. But this is not the only case of Germany. It is more common than expect to find societies throughout history whose members, or most of them, believe in God, in witches, the supernatural, and for whom foreigners were not human. People who believe the race determined moral and intellectual qualities, that men were morally superior to women, that black people were inferior beings, or that Jews were evil. It is not difficult to compare these behaviors with what is happening at present with some jihadist groups. Among the many factors that lead to the Holocaust, there are three that could be considered as the main ones. Firstly, the most violent anti-Semitic people in history reached the power. Secondly, they took the anti-Jewish fantasy originated long before as the core of its state policy and did so in violent terms. In third place, the majority of the society shared those views, which meant that millions of Germans knew about the killings and accepted or said nothing about them. In Ukraine, Poland, France, and other countries, the seed of anti-Semitism were also grown, but that feeling did not turn into genocide just because it did not involve the government action. The responsibility of Germany for the Holocaust, recognized by Konrad Adenauer when he said that National Socialism could not have come to power in Germany if it had not found in most of the population a land cultivated for its poison gases, makes German reconstruction even greater because it is necessary to consider the behavior of a nation before the extremely hard times it had endured in order to assess its capacity or reaction. In that sense, we deeply admire and appreciate the change undergoing by modern Germany as a formidable and generous source of encouragement to the humanity. But this history is not new. To confirm that historic process, this time we are not going to resort to a historian, but to a semiotician, Umberto Eco, who is also one of the most remarkable contemporary writers. In some writings he referred to as occasional, but which show the cleverness and erudition that characterize his work. Eco depicts how the civilized man kept the notion of enemy, that is to say, someone to hate, and if it is possible, to annihilate. Eco explains that having an enemy is important not only to define the identity, but also to find an obstacle against which to measure our system of values, and in seeking to overcome, to demonstrate to our own worth. Therefore, when the enemy does not exist, it is necessary to invent it. In that way, either for racial, cultural motive, or for language or religious reasons, humankind has always created enemies. Among these, foreigners are the most different ones for excellence. As Eco says, Umberto Eco says, ancient Roman bas-reliefs showed barbarians as bearded and flat people, and even such appellation, as it is well known, refers to a defect or speech and thus or thought. Professor Eco adds that blacks are not only aliens among us, but also different for their color. In the first edition of the Encyclopedia Britannica, 1798, the entry for negro, Eco is saying, says, in the complexion of negros, we meet with various shades, but they otherwise differ far from other men in all the features of their face: round cheeks, high cheekbones, a forehead somewhat elevated, a short, broad, flat nose, thick lips, small ears, ugliness and irregularity of shape characterize their external appearance. The Negro women have the loins greatly depressed and very large buttocks, which give the back the shape of a saddle. Vice the most notorious seems to the portion of this unhappy race, idleness, treachery, revenge, cruelty, imprudence, stealing, lying, profanity, debauchery, hastiness, and intemperance, are said to have extinguished the principles of natural law and to have reproof of conscience. They are strangers to every sentiment of compassion and are an awful example of the corruption of man when left to himself. Enemies always smell bad, and their physical differences are despicable. As early as in the 15th century, Fairly Fabre said, "The Saracens emit a terrible stench for which they engage in all kinds of ablutions. And as we do not smell bad, they do not mind sharing a bath with us. They are for sure as lenient as the Hebrews, who stink even more." Equats, it is obvious the gypsies stink for their feet on carrion, as described by Cesar Lombroso in The Criminal Mind in 1876. As early as the beginning of Christianity, Jews were considered monstrous and stinking, given that their mother as an antichrist, the arch-enemy, the enemy not only for us, but also for God. Eco records several texts written from the 4th century onwards, which contains insults to Jewish people. They, say Eco, they feature as follows. They had like a burning flame, blue hot, right eye, green fine line like left eye with two pupils, white eyelids, big lower lip, weak right femur, big feet, elongated and flattened thumbs. The Antichrist will be born from Jewish people, from the union of a mother and a father, and not, as some say, from a virgin alone. At the beginning of the conception, the devil will enter the mother's womb, and by virtue of the devil, he will be nourished inside the womb, and the power of the devil will always be with them. Further testimonies explain, "It shall have two fire eyes, donkey ears, nose and mouth as a lion, because he shall send men the acts of madness from the most wicked fire, and the most shameful voices of contradictions, making them thy gods, spreading throughout their senses the most terrible stench, destroying the institutions of church with the fiercest greed. He will love every with a huge rictus, showing his horrible steel teeth." To those ancient prejudices from the early Middle Age, Wagner, the musician, more recently added some phonetic and mimic aspect. What disgusts us is the physical expression of the Jewish accent, the entirely inappropriate use of our national language. When we hear Jews speak, the absence of any purely human expression hurt us in spite of ourselves. Adolf Hitler also contributed to this ominous tradition. In his Mein Kampf, he already sent this warning: "In the youth, dress must be put into the service of education. If today physical beauty was not entirely forced into the background by our foppish fashions, the seduction of hundreds of thousands of girls by bow-legged, repulsive Jewish bastards will not be possible." At this point, it is inevitable to think that about Samuel Huntington, who 20 years ago stated that the fundamental source of conflict in the post-Cold War would not be primarily ideological or economic, but cultural. Said Huntington, "The clash of civilization will dominate global politics. The fault lines between civilization will be the battle lines of the future. And as people start to define their identity in ethnic and religious terms, Western civilization will be increasingly confronted with non-Western civilizations, which shall entirely reject its most typical ideals: democracy, human rights, freedom, rule of law, and separation of church and state. As maybe the ideas of Huntington could be dogmatic, as well dogmatic his predecessor and antagonist, Francis Fukuyama, author of The End of History. Some, in considering this limitation of Huntington's thinking, we think that nowadays, this kind of ideas is cultural and religious factors are what sustain the still incomprehensible jihadist movement, for example. So the war is not by economic reasons. The war, and not the peace, the war is by cultural reasons, by the history, by the religions, and by the spiritual values of humanity. And I think that the roots of German hatred can be traced long ago, and also the roots of jihadist hatred can trace long ago. As I was saying, the roots of German hatred can be traced long ago, and the same can be traced about the Islamic case, where cultural history, ethnic, racial, and religious factors have an ancient preponderance. To understand the jihadist phenomenon, it is also worth considering the bias towards the hidden roots recently recorded by the most notorious historians about Nazism. The violence of jihadist fanaticism involves elements such as occultism, ignorance, esotericism, which allow us to draw a comparison between these two movements. Nazism started as a small group of fanatics, but thanks to fear and complicity began to gain positions of power until it reached the top of the German state. Out of fear of convenience, first the German and then the Europeans, the states, the Catholic Church, and the bigger economic interests started to accept, admit, or ignoring the Nazi advancements. When interpreting history, there is no place for speculation as who could have happened if. But historians, political and social leaders are tempted to accept the possibility that there was a time, brief but real, when the disgrace of the Nazi adventure could have been stopped. However, there was not a determined joint action in that sense, and when Europe started to react, it was already too late. There are multiple differences between this historical situation, Nazism and jihadism. However, it is worth asking ourselves if now we are missing the last chance to eradicate jihadist violence. Maybe it is time that the Arab war puts an end once and for all to this evil situation that is not only harmful for Western society, but also for Islamism, which, without doubt, has further values to disseminate through it is harmfully associated with a group of fanatics that exhibit their cruel acts as a prowess. Bearing in mind the extraordinary difference between both cases, it is worth asking ourselves again if a timely reaction of the Arab civilization, his government, state, strong economic interests, intellectual leaders, could put an end to violence and terrorism acts performed by jihadist groups who understand that the Quran ordered the holy war against the West and all those who are not Muslims. In this point, I think that we must learn to listen to the voices of the Islamic world. It is not possible to think that 1.2 million Muslims living in the world, a quarter of the world population, share the vision of radical jihadists. Rather, it can be interpreted otherwise, given the increasingly more Muslim voices are rising in favor of peace and rationality. I'm going to mention briefly some opinions. Ala al-Aswani, a talented Egyptian writer, author of bestsellers such as The Jacobian Building, a novel that took place in El Cairo in 1930, where Arab Jews, bourgeois, merchant, intellectuals, and gays coexisted, gives a critical version of the passion of Islam and argues that democracy is the only solution to the Arab disease. Al-Aswani says in an interview a few years ago, there are several interpretations of Islam. Until the late 70s, in Egypt, religion views were open, tolerant, and liberal, that being the reason why Cairo was such a cosmopolitan society with a significant component of Armenians, Jews, Italians, and others. It was a vision of Islam that reflected our national character very well. We had tended towards openness for centuries. But the change were changing. The things were changing. And oil price of the oil, the climate that in some countries acquired unprecedented power in the region, said Al-Aswani. They had millions of dollars to export their Wahhabi vision of Islam. Wahhabi means is known as a rigorous application of Sharia, the Islamic law. And that radical version could not have been more opposite to ours. It is a narrow, intolerant view that goes against women, and it's very aggressive not only with those who are not Muslims, but with non-Wahhabi Muslims. Moreover, said Al-Aswani, in the last 25 years, almost a quarter of Egypt's population has traveled to other countries for work. In general, it was the case of poor and uneducated people, and when they returned, they brought back with them the rigid interpretation of Islam. This could not have been a better Christmas present for any dictator, since in the Wahhabi interpretation, there are no political rights, and there is no right to rebel if the power holder is Muslim. The combination of all these factors led to a steady erosion of freedom, which is the heart of the problem of the region. I will also say that Mr. Omar Saif Gobash, the United Arab Emirates ambassador to Russia, thinks in a similar way. He says recently, we have heard about it ever since September the 11th, that the realm of ideas is where this battle really needs to be fought. But still today, neither the West or the Muslim countries have decided to do so. I think we moderate Muslims have done Islam a disservice, but not providing a clear framework for young men and women, whether in the West or in Indonesia or in the Arab world, to deal with the problems of modernity. There is an existential crisis that young men face when they haven't got a job, when they haven't got a wife, and when they haven't got opportunities? How do we take Islam as this moderate force and provide sustenance to them rather than providing an extremist version of Islam that satisfies their anger and their need for vengeance of some sort? Gobash criticized the self-complacency of a culture that dares not revise history to learn from its mistakes. We don't look at history as a place of debate, of opinion, of proof and evidence. We have these, again, reductive histories. And so you have a checklist of facts, selective facts that are supposedly to help you orient yourself in the world. Gobash is has a British education. But he says, I remember being told that this was a case of Western intellectual imperialism. My response to that was, at least they ask questions. And that's the most important thing. If we look at education as an opportunity to be fed opinions, then yes, it is imperialism. But if we are taught they are to asking questions repeatedly, then you have got an education. That's why I still support Western education in the region. And the last opinion, Ibrahim al-Buhaili is a philosopher and a member of the Shura Council, the advisory body for the King of Saudi Arabia. He is also highly critical of the Muslim culture, which he accused of having despised the role of reason to provide answer from Islam to the problem of our time. He said that the teaching, values, principles, and love that make up Islam and its application through history are not vinculated or linked with the, how to say in Spanish, la vida cotidiana, the quotidian life. Yeah, the daily life. Okay, daily life. So the Muslim values are not linked to the daily life, and that is the problem to learn and to give some values from one generation to another. Our scholars were preoccupied with making reality conform to the teaching of Islam and were not interested in growth of the development of reality. Thus, in mainstream Islamic tradition, it is not uncommon to find critical reference to Muslims engaged in researching things other than Sharia. Ibrahim al-Buhaili denounces that Muslim thinkers have abdicated to study how Islam can contribute to the cultural, social, and political progress in concrete terms, with reference to contemporary life. And he is an enthusiast for reason, and but he is not naive or blind. He freely admits that fallibility of reason, its pitfalls and prejudice, but however says, these negative aspects, he says, cannot be an excuse to ignore the positive ones. He's reclaiming the learning of reason in the Muslim culture. Well, and to finish my words, I should like to mention the lessons from Malala, because she's a young woman recently awarded with the Nobel Prize, comes to give a profound lesson of humanity, and her actions demand deeper thinking. We all know her incredible life adventure, her enormous courage, and fresh dignity. But we should not disregard the grand wave of admiration it has caused. It should actually be brandished as the banner to prevail beyond international organizations and so-called civilizations. As it is well known, and when she was still 15, now she's 17, Malala Yousafzai, a Pakistani, underwent a grueling attack on her way home after finishing some tests at school. The bus she was traveling on with 15 other girls was approached by 2 armed men who, after identifying Malala, shot her. The bullets hit the child's head, but her attackers thought she was dead. However, Malala made it alive to tell the history and keep facing barbarians with pen and pencils. Her name had come into the spotlight when it was learned that she was the girl who wrote a blog in the BBC website, the British public television, under the pseudonym of Gal Mackay, during the Taliban rule of the Stat Valley in northern Pakistan between 2008 and 2009. It was at that time when many children, especially girls, were deprived of schools, first due to the Taliban banning and then because of the intense fighting which lasted almost half a year. The Taliban had issued, said Malala, had issued an edict banning all girls from attending school. Only 11 students attended the class out of 27. It was not an irrational fear. A report published by the Pakistani army at that time claimed that the Taliban had beheaded 13 girls, destroyed 107 schools, and bombed 5 others. Her words raised the extremists who sent their gunmen to kill her. Miraculously, the teenager survived. She had an operation in her country and was transferred to then she was transferred to the cave where she's living now. Since the attack, this young girl has refused to be intimidated and has multiplied the calls for education and tolerance. She said, "So let us wage a glorious struggle against illiteracy, poverty, and terrorism. Let us pick up our books and our pens. They are the most powerful weapons." Malala not only speaks of courage and dignity, but she also refers to our books and pens, school and education. So she emphasizes the issue to meet in the long term, education, which is the only truly liberation guarantee. However, she is also referring to her blog on the BBC, thus giving a clue as to how peaceful revolutions of the new era will develop. The spirit of internet and social networks, which, as we know, have already taken the Arab world. When the Berlin Wall fell 25 years ago, each German listened the radio of West Germany and other European countries, and that was impossible for the Soviet dictatorship to control. They must not have been the only or may reason for the collapse of the wall, but it was certainly an important factor. Today, social networks rule, and young people have access to them naturally. Will Islamic fanaticism be able to resist the invasion of communications? Okay. We don't know, because the dictators in power make sure people stay away from telecommunications. But it is almost impossible for a dictatorship to permanently prevent the access of young people to social networks. Our impression, therefore, is that sooner or later, the Islamic fanaticisms will not stop the impact of telecommunications. So, in a relatively near future, in historical terms, change will be taking place, and they will have their process and become a fact in the medium or long term, but this is inexorable. History, which may be surprising, but at the end is always progressive, shows that there are cycles and counter-cycles, as it has been thought by the great historians. Countries and their people or large institutions overcome their own miserable past. Sometimes progress zigzags, but there is no doubt that behind it, humanity resolves its outrageous contradictions, and after violence, the path to peace opens up again. Thank you very much.